there's no possible way to have a worldview filled with factual statements that doesn't already have implicit in it a whole set of values. You will value only that which you consider to be real.
Yeah.
And as soon as you have a worldview and a set of values, then you have a way of life that's going to flow out of those.
Okay, so to follow in sequence, what happened next is you went to Europe, didn't you?
I bolted, but I bolted in a rather mild-mannered way. And that is, I just wanted to get out.
Yes.
I had
Yeah.
been raised largely in
Yeah.
California up to that point, although with years in Europe. But I was fluent in German at the time.
Yeah.
And I just wanted a radical change of pace, but in a way that would not be closing doors, slamming them shut
Yes,
behind
yeah.
me, no burning of
Yeah.
bridges. And so in the University of California, there was then, and there still is, the option of spending your third year in university abroad. And so there were many options, many universities around the world, but I was fluent in German, and I felt very comfortable in German culture, and so why not? And so the German university that was part of this network, it was the University of Göttingen. So I arranged to spend my third year of university in Göttingen, total change of pace, get some breath of fresh air, and yet in a way that was still legitimate. That is, I wouldn't burn any bridges. It's just a third year after all.
Yeah.
So nobody would raise the eyebrows and say, "What on earth are you doing?"
Yeah.
And my parents wouldn't be too upset. In fact, they would not be upset at all.
And what happened when you got to Germany?
Well, what really happened before I got to Germany, and that is I spent about 2 years in classic style in 1970 of an American coming to Europe. I had my backpack, I had a guitar, I had a pocket full of traveler's checks, and I spent 2 months hitchhiking around Western Europe. And in this hitchhiking with a roommate from college, we eventually came to a youth hostel in an utterly charming little Swiss village called Grindelwald near the Jungfrau.
Right.
And it's utterly charming. The youth hostel there is just extraordinary. It's just lovely. And we stayed there a few days, my roommate and I, because it was just so lovely. And I noticed that somebody had clearly left behind a book in English. And it caught my eye. And I don't have much thievery in my blood. I'm not a natural thief. So I wouldn't have taken it if I thought it belonged to somebody else. But it was clearly left behind. So I said, okay, it has no owner. I'll pick it up. Somebody else has used it. They've released it. I'll take it. It was the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. And it was a book from Tibetan Buddhism. It entailed a translation, a foreword by the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. And it was edited by a fellow named Evans Wentz. And it was on the nature of consciousness. And I read through this, and it was just like, how should we say, just bells going off. Like, this resonates, this is it, what I've been seeking for and not finding, this is it. It was like picking up a scent. I don't understand this book in its entirety by any means, but this is it. It was very strong intuition. And I read through it, and it was just thrilling. Wherever this came from, I have to trace this to its source. And it was profoundly spiritual. It was all about liberation. It was about spiritual awakening. It was very rational. Clearly, it wasn't simply calling for allegiance to some doctrine or some divine authority. But it was also very experiential, and in that way, in being empirical, it was scientific. So I was finding in this one volume something that was smart philosophy, deeply spiritual, and very empirical, and therefore scientific. And I thought, okay, this is it. Because what I had found thus far was fragmentation. Fragmentation,
just bringing it together
polarization.
for the first time.
And this was the first time I'd seen something that really integrated.
Yeah.
So my roommate and I started hitchhiking up north, and we went through Germany, through Sweden, up into Norway. We came to Oslo, came out to Bergen, and he was spending his third year abroad in Scotland. And so we parted ways in Berlin. And this is, for me, quite a seminal point, or quite a turning point in my life, because the night before he took off the next morning. The night before, I wrote in my journal, this book is really doing it for me. This is it. I need to pursue this. But at this point, simply having a book isn't enough. And for myself at that time, age 20, the archetype for me was a wise old man. And I wrote in my journal, I urgently need to I must find a wise old man who will give me some personal guidance to set me on my path. And that was it. So the next morning, my roommate and I amicably parted ways. He took the ferry across to Scotland. And now, for the first time for the whole summer, I'm hitchhiking alone on this long road from Bergen to Oslo and then down to Göttingen. And somebody dropped me off in the middle of the wilderness. They gave me a ride for an hour or two, what have you. And there I was hitchhiking by myself and not getting a ride. I think I waited for 5 hours. Nobody picked me up. And what we heard is not too long before then, some hitchhikers had robbed a driver, a motorist. That didn't go over too well. So they were maybe a little bit skitterish about picking up a male hitchhiker. So I started walking against the grain of traffic to the nearest railway station to get a train out of there and hitchhike from some other place where the motorists weren't so spooked. But as I walked against the grain of traffic, I held out my thumb, rather absent-mindedly, like, okay, I'm still hitchhiking, but going against the grain of traffic. Before long, I saw that a little black VW Bug had pulled over to the side of the road. And a little old man kind of waved to me, like, would you like a ride? I said, oh, yeah, I was hitchhiking. I stared at my thumb, oh, hi. And so I went over to his car, threw my backpack and guitar in the back seat, sat in the passenger seat with him. He took me all of 10 minutes before he was taking off up into the hills where he had a chalet. And in 10 minutes, here I was really fascinated by Tibetan Buddhism, looking for a guide, a wise old man. Here was an old man. It turned out he was a Buddhist monk. A Buddhist monk who lived in Nepal, lived with Tibetans. And we learned and he learned of my interest in Buddhism, my interest in really fathoming the nature of consciousness. And we learned all of this in 10 minutes. Well,
and you'd written in your journal the day before.
The day before.
So it was somehow putting it out there, wasn't it?
Well, you know, the Indians have been saying for millennia, when the disciple is ready, the guru appears. I suddenly started taking that kind of talk very seriously. Because how many Buddhist monks there were in Europe in 1970, I think you can count on one hand.
You found one of them.
And I got one of them. And he'd lived in Nepal with Tibetans. And he would spend his winters lecturing on Buddhism and Indian culture, lecturing all over the continent. So we just immediately took to each other. And he pulled over and we had an ice cream together, we chatted on, and then he gave me just the quintessential advice I wanted. It was very simple, it was to the point. He dropped me off and then he took off up into the mountains where I had a chalet, and I continued hitchhiking down to Göttingen, and where I found a Tibetan Lama on the faculty. And there were very, very few Tibetan Lamas on any faculty in Europe at that time, but this Lama had been appointed there just a year before, I think, by the Dalai Lama. And so by the time I got down to Göttingen, and settled in a little bit, I found that they had no classes being offered in what I was my primary area of academic interest, ecology. The philosophy, frankly, I found dry and not helpful, but there was this Tibetan Lama on the faculty in their Indology department, or Indologische Seminar. And so I recognized right then that if this is the direction I really want to go, I've got to learn Tibetan. Because in 1970, there were hardly any Tibetans that were bilingual and hardly any Westerners that could speak Tibetan. I said, the doors won't open unless I can get fluency in this language, frankly, as quickly as possible. So I dropped all my other courses.
And you went to India to learn?
Well, I spent a year there in Germany and just studied Tibetan, and then I read voraciously about Buddhism, Hinduism.
I think you were reading 8 hours a day, I think you were telling me earlier. You read
about 8 hours a day, up to 8 hours a day. I was just reading voraciously, and I had a very, very specific agenda. Number one, I wanted to learn as much about this tradition as I could, and its relationship with other contemplative traditions. So the Sufi, the Kabbalah, the Christian, the Taoist, Hinduism, Vedanta, and so forth. So I read very broadly, and bear in mind, I was taking only one course, so I had a lot of free time.
You must be getting really excited at this time, wasn't it? You were feeling you're kind of getting, you're starting to get the information, the leads, and it's starting to come together. I was like a hunting dog that had picked up the scent. And, you know, baying, like the beagle baying, I'm getting it here. But I had an agenda. And it was, for me, again, one of those core, almost existential agendas. And here's what it was. It was quite conscious in my mind at the time. And that is, I'd seen a lot of disparity thus far. I mean, science says, a lot of scientists, not science itself, but a lot of scientists said the whole world is just physical. Anything that doesn't look physical is simply an emergent property of the physical, therefore consciousness, mind, and so forth. It's nothing but brain function, and just get over it. That's all we are. We are animals with the mind oozing from the neurons, like bile is oozed from the gallbladder. So we had that one, and that one's profoundly incompatible with Christianity, which says a whole bunch of very different things. And so I'd found a lot of incompatibility. And then, of course, Christianity is very different from Hinduism. Hinduism is different from Taoism. So we find an awful lot of, how do you say, incompatibility of worldviews.